Welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.
Welcome to episode 15 of the Center of Everywhere. I'm Kelly Ash, Research Associate for the Center for Rural Policy and Development. Today marks the start of the 2021 Minnesota legislative session, a session that will likely be very different than any other session, since it will begin and likely remain an online affair. Our CEO, Julie Tesh, got an opportunity to chat with Scott McMahon, the Executive Director of the Greater Minnesota Partnership, about the issues that he'll be bringing to legislators on behalf of rural Minnesota, how there needs to be more understanding that challenges and opportunities look different in rural areas compared to metro areas, and how the heck do you lobby without a lobby?
Hello and welcome to the Center of Everywhere podcast. My name is Julie Tesh and I am the President and CEO of the Center for Rural Policy and Development. With us today is Scott McMahon, who is Executive Director of the Greater Minnesota Partnership. Hello, Scott.
Hello, how are you, Julie?
Doing really well. The beginning of 2021 is not too shabby. How about you?
You know, the start of 2021 is always good. I'm glad 2020 is behind us. It can only get better from here. And, we have the added benefit of the legislature starting tomorrow. So we'll see how the start of 2021 really gets going.
Yeah, it is. It's crazy to think that everything gets underway this week. It's mind-boggling after last year. It's like, oh my gosh, we have a lot of work to do, both statewide and federally and everywhere. But why don't you tell our listeners about the Greater Minnesota Partnership?
Sure, I would love to. So the Greater Minnesota Partnership is, we're about an 8-year-old organization, and we actually got started as a result of some work that the center had done a decade ago, looking at who is the voice for Greater Minnesota. And the conclusion you came to was, well, nobody really is the voice for Greater Minnesota. You know, there are some groups out there that spoke on portions of it. And at the same time, the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities was having the same conversation and realizing that there was a need for a stronger voice for Greater Minnesota focused in on economic development conversations. And so between the work that you all had done and the work that the coalition had done, we created the Greater Minnesota Partnership to be a collection of businesses, local governments, foundations, higher education, kind of all the stakeholders around Greater Minnesota to champion policies of the state that would promote economic development, economic prosperity, job growth, workforce development throughout Greater Minnesota communities. And so what we try and do is really focus in on what are the things that we need to have healthy communities in Greater Minnesota, and what are either the state policies or state investments that are needed to achieve that end. And so right now we have about 65 members from all across the state who set our policies and help us figure out what the issues are we're going to work on, help us think through, what it is that we really need to accomplish this mission of making sure that the Greater Minnesota has a voice at the table at the Capitol and has what we need to thrive and succeed.
That's awesome. What are some of the successes policy-wise that you've had so far in the last 8 years?
Sure. It's broad. A lot of it is really just kind of the issues that are popping up. So we were one of the first voices out there really championing broadband expansion in the state. We were the leading voice creating the border-to-border broadband program, which has had a tremendous impact, although we're not fully there to the border-to-border aspect, but we're moving that direction. We have also done some specific job training programs to provide resources for businesses that just need to retool their workers in a quick way. We have in the past couple of years been very active in the childcare conversation. I think we all know, especially thanks to the work that you all did a couple of years ago, that the childcare crisis is really deep in Greater Minnesota. It's deep everywhere, but in particular in Greater Minnesota, and it manifests itself differently in our communities. And so we, for the past 2 or 3 years, have been really involved in that issue. And we were fortunate in the past couple of years to get some investment into our initiative foundations for them to continue with the work that they've been doing at a larger scale. And then we got a new program created last session, or actually not in the last session, it was in the 5th special session when we finally got a bonding bill to create a capital pool to try and build out more childcare capacity in Greater Minnesota. So, that's a quick list of some of the things we've done, but we've been working in housing and broadband, childcare, workforce development, kind of name the issues that we all know are big ones in Greater Minnesota, and we've had a role in those spaces.
That's fantastic. And like you said, they're kind of evergreen issues. They're things that are always going to be there. And we're going to talk more here in a little bit just about broadband, housing, workforce, and things like that, and what you see in the future. But thank you for all of the work that the Greater Minnesota Partnership has done. I know we had talked a couple of weeks ago talking about how the center, we provide the research and you guys take it from there and advocate for Greater Minnesota. And it's just wonderful the work that you do.
Well, and the similar sentiment to you, Julie, is that without the work that the center does, some of these issues really don't pop up for us. The way that you framed the childcare conversation in Greater Minnesota with the report back in 2017,
Mm-hmm.
really changed everybody's understanding of that issue. When we all of a sudden realized that we have these 35,000 childcare slots that were missing in Greater Minnesota, and being able to tell, kind of what's going on in Northeast Minnesota versus Southwest Minnesota, it helps all of us understand and be able to show how the issues are different geographically, how the issues are different Greater Minnesota versus the metro. And that's one of the biggest things that we have to work on within the partnership, is getting policymakers to understand that, yes, we have a housing problem, but the housing problem is different in the metro than it is in Greater Minnesota. Yes, we have a childcare problem everywhere, but it's different in the metro than it is in Greater Minnesota. Yes, we have a workforce issue, but it's different in the different areas. And the more work that we can have from a research basis that shows how those problems are being felt in the real world in our communities, the better off we are in being able to address them. So thank you for the work that you guys are doing.
Absolutely. And amen to that. You can't, every issue is different, no matter if you live in St. Paul or if you live in, Redwood Falls, Red Lake Falls, wherever. And so hopefully we can continue to help people realize that and provide that information. That's what we're here to do, is to provide that information to legislators and to lawmakers. So let me ask you to look into your crystal ball. We have a big session coming up. It is obviously we have several new legislators on board. It is a budget year. We right now have a deficit. I forget how much, but we might not, depending upon the federal government. So maybe not. What are you thinking here in January, just looking out over the next couple months?
That's a big question. And it's a big question
for days.
It's a big question for a number of different reasons. One is this will be a legislative session like we've never seen before, because it's going to be done virtually. We had the tail end of last session was done virtually. And the legislature did a great job of trying to figure out quickly how to manage it. But this is going to be the first time in which we start from day one having virtual meetings. And so from a lobbyist standpoint, my question is always, how do you lobby when there isn't a lobby? So we all need to figure out how to do our jobs differently. But looking at this session, the good news is we have a $641 million surplus for the remainder of this biennium. And this biennium goes through the end of June. We spent some of that money in December when we did the business COVID bill. Some of that will hopefully be reimbursed with the bill that the Feds just passed. We're still waiting to see what that is going to look like. But the big looming picture for this session is going to be the budget that we're going to set over the next 5 months for the upcoming biennium, which will be the 2 years starting July 1st, 2021. And for that, we have a projected $1.273 billion budget deficit. Now, to put this in perspective for you, last February, when we had the budget forecast come out, we were projecting, and I'm not going to be completely accurate on the numbers here because I don't have them in front of me, but a $1.5 billion budget surplus. And then COVID happened. We shut our economy down, and the state did an informal projection in May for how things were going to look. And they were talking, a $4 billion budget deficit, very big swing in a very short period of time. And then the December forecast came out and things started looking better. Our next budget forecast, it will come out in February. And if I were to place a bet on it right now, I would say that we'll see the economy looking better in February than we did in the December forecast. So that $1.273 billion budget deficit will likely come down some degree. But at the same time, it could go up. It's just a matter of how things are looking over the next month and a half. But that February number will be the one that the legislature then focuses in on setting the budget. That's what they need to base their budget for the upcoming biennium. The interesting thing with this session is that it will be, the legislature has to adjourn by a specific date in May, and it's the first Monday after the third Sunday in May. It just happens that with the way the calendar works out this year, it is the earliest date that we can adjourn this year. So we have the shortest session to try and deal with a $1.25 billion budget deficit. The reality is we have to have that budget set by the end of June. And so if we continue the path that we've been on for the past number of years, we don't quite get our work done at the legislature by the end of the session, we may have some work to do in June to wrap things up. But I think between the governor and the two caucuses and the House and the Senate, they'll get the work done at some point. It may not be by the end of the session, but by the end of June, we'll have a budget set and we'll move forward.
That, what are you seeing this year at the legislature? Just people wanting to understand rural, or are people willing to listen? What's your gut feeling telling you?
I think in the past couple of years, we have seen a greater willingness to look at state policies from a geographic standpoint. And I commend, the work that the partnership has had with our sister organization, the Coalition of Greater Minnesota Cities, in helping to paint that reality. We've had some great partnerships, and I think when you look at the work that the jobs committees have done in the past biennium to kind of look at some of these issues on a geographic basis. I think childcare is a great example of where we have been able to do that, where we've got some specific funding targeted at the state to address the issue, but then some different buckets targeted at Greater Minnesota versus the metropolitan area by investing in Greater Minnesota. We've had a strong partnership with the Initiative Foundation on the childcare front, but there's some other organizations in the metro that got some funding. And so I think the legislature is starting to realize maybe some of these solutions are best addressed geographically. Or on the flip side, maybe some of these challenges are best addressed by local partners. Whether you're looking at a metro Greater Minnesota divide, maybe the reality is a group out of Owatonna focusing in on Owatonna issues may be better able to address them than a group in Duluth working on Owatonna issues.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think of the legislative body, and we ask a lot of them. They're supposed to know everything about everyone and every organization, and that's virtually impossible. And, a big hurdle for our organization is just having more people read our research and seeing it as relevant. Not just the rural legislators, the Greater Minnesota legislators, but those urban legislators, which obviously there are more of continually. And I just wonder what types of tactics you think of or ideas you have for working with them and getting them to realize that there's actually a lot more in common with Greater Minnesota than they think.
Yeah, it's always a tricky question to figure out how how to deal with the legislature and stuff like that, because you're dealing with 201 different individuals who come together as a collection within the two bodies. And so it's always what's going to be best working with that individual. And I think, one of the things that's been helpful in recent years has been the introduction of social media into the dissemination of information. Obviously, with any new tool, there's good that can be done with it and evil that can be done with it. But I think it's a great way of getting information disseminated, getting people to pay attention to things. But more importantly, it's a way of getting others to be able to communicate your message for you. And I think that's one of the things that we've tried to do with our partnership with the center is, how can we take the work that you're doing from a research standpoint and turn it into policy initiatives that can address the issues that you're highlighting. And so, I think one of the things that we do frequently is, take your graphics and take your data and take your information and use it in a way that that gets it into the hands of legislators in a different way than you sending a report or having a press release or whatnot. And so I think, the future of advocacy and message distribution is going to be more about how you capture other people's voices to take your message forward.
Sure. Agreed. And there's a lot of new legislators and a lot of new staff.
Yes.
That are going to be learning a lot in the coming months. Let's jump in and, talking about economic development in Greater Minnesota and the three issues, that I think are paramount to economic development. We've already discussed, but I want to get more in depth, but talking about childcare, broadband, and housing. And those are three things that obviously you and I think about daily, that we need these things to have positive economic development, but I don't know if a regular person, living in New Ulm necessarily thinks of that. But let's start with broadband. I know I tend to get confused sometimes with the different pots of money. And, we have the border to border broadband funding, and that's great. And now there's, in the 2018 Farm Bill, there was the Community Connect grants. And now with COVID, telehealth is so important. That's how a lot of people, or more people, are getting their medical care. And so can you talk about just what these different programs are and how they might get used across the state?
Sure. So, the one nice thing in Minnesota is we end up with different buckets of money, whether it's state money or federal money or different tagline money, depending on what the bill of the week is. But all of the money goes to the Department of Employment and Economic Development. And so we're fortunate we have a great group over there working these issues. And so what they end up doing is taking all these buckets of money and working with them to make sure that they're deployed across the state in the most effective way. And so I spend less time focus in on, what do we have coming from the feds and what do we have coming from the state, and more about what do we have in the total pot and how do we best use those dollars to accomplish our goals. And so we've got in Minnesota, we have some broadband goals, and the goal that I focus in on most right now is our 2026 goal, which states that we want to have speeds for everybody of 100 download, 25 upload by 2026. And we're not there yet, and we shouldn't be there yet. It's just 2021. But we've got a lot of work to do between now and then. And this is where one of the geographic divides really comes into play. When you look at the 7-county metropolitan area, we're at about 98% of the way there across all properties in those 7 counties. In Greater Minnesota, we have some counties in the same area, and our average is, I want to say it's in the low to mid 70s for attainment right now. But we have some counties that are as low as 33% attainment of the 2026 goal at this point. That's a problem. And that problem has really been elevated in COVID, because all of a sudden when you have kids who need to go to school, virtually and they need broadband, and you're at 33% of, having true high speed internet. Or if you're a business in those communities trying to deal with your employees not being in your office or in your facility, those present real problems. And so we know what we need to do to get to the 2026 goal. It's going to take investment. It's going to take expansion of, dropping line and getting properties connected. But the question is, can we get enough money between now and 2025 to build out the infrastructure we need by 2026? The good thing is the feds have stepped up recently to provide more funding for that. The state has stepped up to provide more funding for it. And so we'll see if we get there. But it's going to take some work and it takes some effort to get us all into that setting.
Yeah, it doesn't just magically appear. I know living here in rural part of the state, 5 miles south of me, they have full high-speed internet, but they have a different co-op that they work with. Mm-hmm. And so it really does depend upon where you're at. And I'm glad that there is money coming in. I wonder about mapping. I know that has been a problem as well, is just mapping on where everything is at, where there's access and where there isn't. Do you see anything on that?
There's been a lot of effort on that. I think the biggest challenge with mapping, especially once you get into greater Minnesota, is you lose a lot of density. And mm-hmm. So you may have a property and then several miles down the road, you have the next property. And then several miles down the road, you've got a township and then you've got a town, and whatnot. There has been a lot of effort recently to really try and build out that data, so we have a better understanding. I think groups like the Blandon Foundation have done a great job of committing some resources into this and building out partnerships to try and gather the information that we need to make these decisions. And so the data is getting better, but it's still not perfect. But I think where we are today in understanding where the shortfalls are is better than we were, 2-3 years ago. But I think one of the real challenges that we have, and that we're starting to see more and more, is from an economic development standpoint, we're focusing in on getting every property tied into the right high-speed internet. But we don't necessarily have the focus right now on how to prioritize property A versus property B.
Sure.
And so, right now, from a state policy standpoint, we kind of view property A and property B as the same. But a property A is a business and property B is somebody's second home lake house. Shouldn't we probably have a priority of getting the speed built up for property A before doing property B? So I think those are some of the things that we now need to wrestle through with over the next 4 years as to how we take the investment and the resources that we have to best utilize them moving forward.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. And just thinking of, I think back to when I lived in St. Paul for 15 years, and then I moved out east and I was in Washington, D.C. And while I enjoyed my time there, I always said, boy, it would just be amazing if I could go back to rural Minnesota and do my job from there. Now, I'm back in rural Minnesota. I don't have that same job, but I'm getting to do something I'm equally passionate about, and I get to work from here. And I think it's just great. And I think economic development wise, I'll be curious in the future to see if there aren't more people that do move out to greater Minnesota, but we need the broadband and the housing and healthcare and childcare and everything. So
we do it. And I'll be fascinated to see 5 years from now what the post-COVID recovery looks like. Mm-hmm. Because you look at downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul, and they're pretty vacant right now.
Yeah.
And you've got a lot of those folks are now working out of greater Minnesota in many cases. I've been talking with community leaders across the state. It's really hard to find a lake property right now because everybody took advantage of the pandemic to kind of say, if I can work anywhere, why wouldn't I want to work, when there's a lake right there? Mm-hmm. And so I'll be intrigued to see kind of what it looks like going forward. do we have a renaissance of people wanting to be in greater Minnesota because they realize that they can telecommute and work from anywhere? Who knows?
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah, it'll be very interesting. And I guess sliding into the next issue is housing. You talk about lake homes, but it, number one, affordable housing, but number two, just housing. I know for myself, looking for a place to buy, boy, the properties here in the Waseca area they're going so quick.
Mhm.
I mean, you really have to be ahead of the curve, and I know it's that way in other parts of the state. And it's a great problem to have if you're the seller, but if you're the buyer, um, boy, what a problem, because we're not being able to grow as much in greater Minnesota because we just don't have the housing, and especially workforce housing. I think of the townhomes, the apartments, things like that. When you drive up and down I-35, when you're in Lakeville, there's there's a billboard there talking about working in Owatonna. And I know that I think it's Federated Insurance that has invested money in more housing because Owatonna area just doesn't have the housing capabilities, so curious looking here during session, what are some of those things that you're looking at in housing policy or budget?
Yeah, housing is one of those areas where, again, we need to start thinking differently about the metropolitan issues in housing and greater Minnesota's issues in housing. If you talk to a business in greater Minnesota about their willingness to locate or expand in our communities, a lot of the things that come up aren't necessarily their direct business operations and their ability to be successful in this community. You hear a lot about housing stock and does this community have the houses that my future employees are going to want? Does this community have access to the childcare that my families are going to need to make things work? And so, when you look at greater Minnesota versus the metro, and from a state policy standpoint, one of the unfortunate things that happens is often when we set state policy, it's done so through a lens of the metropolitan problem.
Mm-hmm.
And not necessarily the statewide problem. And I do want to commend you all for your recent studies on the housing issue, because it's helped us figure out a different way to communicate the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you look in the metropolitan area, there truly is an affordable housing crisis in the metro. Property values are sky high, and getting into something that a lower moderate income family can afford is a real challenge. In greater Minnesota, in many cases, affordable housing is there. The problem is that somebody is currently living in it. And they may want a nicer, newer house, but they can't afford it because the cost of building that property is more than they can afford, or more, unfortunately, more than the house would be appraised for once it's constructed, which just creates a real market problem in housing. And so, what we're trying to figure out is how do you build that housing, whether it's multifamily or single family, that allows the people who are currently living in a community to move up to that next level of housing, to open up that initial housing to be available for folks coming in. When you look at a lot of our communities, an average market rate house of existing housing stock may be $90,000, $100,000, $110,000. That's affordable housing. You can't build an affordable housing unit today of new construction for anywhere near that cost. And so if you have a $100,000 house that gets vacated in a community, and you can put in an additional $30,000 of renovations into it and get that into the hands of a lower income family, then they've got home ownership, they've got equity. That family that was there has moved into their forever home, and it starts to create a market. And so some of the things that we're looking at from a policy standpoint is how do we start to bend that curve on new construction so that it isn't as expensive either for the developer or for the buyer, so that we can start to bring it back into some level of equilibrium. And so one thing we're looking at is, can we create a fund that cities can tap into to cover some of the utility expansion costs that go into development that ultimately get passed on to the developer, get passed on to the consumer, that do increase those costs of development, with the hope of bringing that cost down and making it more accessible or more financeable going forward. The other thing is, we do know that the existing housing stock in a lot of our communities is older and hasn't been updated in a number of years. When the elderly couple that's been living in the house since the 1960s moves on in the nursing home or passes, and the kids are trying to figure out what to do with it, a lot of times that house hasn't been updated or touched since the 1970s, and it just needs some work done to it. And so, can we create some pots of money to allow some of that investment to happen, so that we can start to build that market and start to create the opportunities for the transition to happen. So we'll see where things go. Unfortunately, we are dealing in a world recession where we do have a projected budget deficit, and so it's harder to have these conversations about new spending and new investments. But at the same time, we know we need them today in order to have an impact tomorrow.
Right. Are you aware of any private public partnerships that around the state that may have worked with housing, a company being able to work with their local municipality or their county to improve housing?
There are examples all across the state of the great things going on. And we've got great organizations across the state, whether it's the Southwest Minnesota Housing Partnership and such, that are engaged in these conversations and trying to find opportunities. And it's not that these things can't happen. It just takes a lot more work and effort from a community to make it happen. There's a great example of in Austin, where one of their most recent developments is it's a multifamily housing setting that almost everybody in the community wants to get into, but it's income restricted property.
Okay.
And it's some of the nice properties that they have there because it's the newest construction and whatnot. And so, I think it's just a matter of figuring out the conversations and where things can go going forward. But, the time has come where these things need to happen, because we're at the point where businesses are making the decisions about what they're going to do with housing as a part of it. And if a community doesn't have the housing options that they need for their expansion, they're not going to grow in that community. They're going to look for the next one to go into, which is fine if that company stays in Minnesota. But when they cross the border into Iowa, or Wisconsin, or the Dakotas, because they've got the investment and they've got the housing, then we lose those jobs and we lose that economic prosperity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think of going back to the senior citizen housing and somebody, not having updated their house for decades, and thinking in greater Minnesota, just that senior citizen housing and what is it? What does that look like? Because we're trying to keep our older generation in their homes as long as we can, but the baby boomers are continuing to retire, and there's more and more of them, obviously, and people are living longer. And yeah, just the housing stock, I just think of that. It's like, okay, in greater Minnesota, how is that going to happen? You drive through the Twin Cities and you see housing developments of different, retirement community type things, but you don't see that in greater Minnesota as much. So just curious on your thoughts on that.
It's part of the problem and the solution. If you wander through the metro and in greater Minnesota, communities like Rochester, Duluth, St. Cloud, Mankato, you're going to see it where you have the senior living and the transitional setting where, I'm a 65-year-old married couple that don't want to be in my house anymore, but I can move into this place. And then as my needs continue and, I wander into true old age and memory care and whatnot, I can just kind of move around the facility and have the care that I'm looking for. Those are great opportunities. And it's what our aging population is looking for. But if you wander through greater Minnesota, a lot of our communities, when you look at senior care, you're looking at the traditional nursing home setting where it's more of an institutional feel, it's more healthcare driven versus lifestyle driven. And one of the things we need to figure out is how do we get more of that kind of development happening in greater Minnesota? Is it a private market investment opportunity, or does it need some incentives to happen? What's the scale? How big of a community do you need to have to make something like this sustainable? And then the other question that comes in with the senior housing side is, we're in the bubble right now where we have the baby boomers aging and wandering through the system with a much smaller population following them. And so if you build all this capacity for senior housing, what's the life cycle of it? What's it going to be post baby boomers?
Right.
And I think that's one of the big questions that everybody's trying to figure out too.
No, that's a great point. Gosh, I hate to think about that because I'm in that next group. So, geez. Those excerpts, I don't know. Let's talk about childcare. That goes right into economic development and having proper childcare. And we'll be having a report coming out in February, following up on, regulations that have happened over the last few years and how those are playing out. Prior to COVID, what we had almost 40,000 childcare slots open.
Yep. Where the latest numbers from First Children's Finance are still right just north of 40,000 within greater Minnesota.
My goodness. So I know that there's, committees and task forces and the whole 9 yards. What are you all looking at this session as far as childcare?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I hate having to keep harping on this being the issue, but again, it's a market problem. The marketplace for childcare just doesn't work. And, if you talk to Democrats about the issue, they're going to tell you that it's a funding problem, which it is. If you talk to Republicans, they're going to tell you it's a regulation problem, which it is. The reality is it's both a funding and a regulation problem. And, what we need to try and figure out is how do we get more providers into the marketplace? How do we get them staying in the marketplace? And how do we get them earning a wage and a living that that gets them to stay in the business? Right now, in a lot of our communities, you can choose to have a family childcare business in your basement, or you can go work at your local gas station and work at your local gas station and get higher pay, better benefits, better hours, and not have to deal with, changing babies' diapers all day long. And so I don't envy the folks who are making the decision about where they're going to go. But end of the day, we still need childcare because our employers need their workers. The workers have kids. And if the kids aren't in school, we need them to be somewhere so that our employees can be in the workplace getting the job done. And so I think, there are some really big issues we need to look at. One of them is the licensure structure around childcare. The reality is childcare is an expensive undertaking in which you don't have the ability to grow your business because if you've got 10 kids in your home setting, we're not going to let you have 20 because that's not a safe situation for those families. And in greater Minnesota on the childcare center side, it's hard for a lot of our communities to have a large enough center to make the economies of scale work in the setting. And so, are there some things that we can do on a regulation standpoint to ease the burden and to make it easier? Absolutely. And so I think licensure is one of them. We've got a great example up in the Little Falls area where there are 5 counties who have partnered with Sourcewell to manage their child care and licensing and inspection process. And we've seen some tremendous results in their ability to retain childcare providers, because what's happening is since you've got one group dealing with the licensing through the inspection, there's a different mindset that comes into play there. And most of the people that have working for them are former childcare providers themselves. And so rather than coming in and being a disciplinary focused inspection model, they're a supportive inspection process where they're trying to help the business succeed. They're trying to help develop the providers to understand why it is that you need these safety precautions in place and to go from there. So that's one of the things we're looking at is how do we take that model and take it to the next level. We've got some things that we're looking at with the Child Care Assistance Program. And, this is the state's subsidy program for childcare for families that qualify based off of their income. And there are just some screwy things that come into play with the program. And I just want to give you one example with this. And this is, this wouldn't be a real example because nobody would ever have all of their kids be CCAP kids. But I just want to give you a sense as to how the numbers play out.
Okay.
And so I looked at 3 communities this morning, all within a 15 to 18 mile radius of each other, down in southeast Minnesota. So we're looking at Grand Meadow in Mower County, Spring Valley in Fillmore County, and Stewartville in Olmsted County. If I'm a childcare provider, a home-based childcare provider in those 3 communities, and all of my kids are CCAP kids, if I'm in Mower, my annual income is going to be about $62,000 a year. And that's before I have all my expenses for the food and everything. So that's not what I'm going to make. That's just what I'm going to bring in for revenue. And I'm going to expense out all of my other stuff. If I move 15 miles east over to Spring Valley, my revenue increases by $4,500 with that same mix of kids. If I move then 18 miles north up to Stewartville in Olmsted County, my revenue increases $2,200. And then if I move all the way up to the cities and operate in basically any one of the 7 counties in the metro, my revenue will jump $7,600. So between Grand Meadow at the low end and someplace in Hennepin County on the high end, it's a $14,000 revenue difference.
Wow.
When we know that the cost of operating a home-based childcare center has a difference of maybe $1,000 or $2,000 wherever you are in the state, because meals for 10 kids cost basically the same whether you're in Hennepin County or Mower County. Cleaning supplies, kind of the same thing. Your licensing, your regulations, your business operations are the same, but yet the program is set up in a way in which it values a $14,000 swing just based off of where you are geographically. So I can tell you right now, if I'm in Grand Meadow, I'm going to try and figure out how to move my business, 15 miles north up to Stewartville in Olmsted County, and all of a sudden, make, $7,000 more a year.
Right. Why not? I mean, why wouldn't you? That's a good business move. Like you said before, you're limited on what you can't grow more than you are licensed for.
Exactly. I'm going to have those 10 kids. That's my only option. So about some of the things that we're looking at from those. And so those are kind of the big market changes that we see that need to happen. Those are the long-term solutions. The reality is we're not going to fix those things this session.
Right.
So what can we do now to, put a Band-Aid on the bleeding and move some things forward? And so we've got a couple of proposals that we're working on. One is continue the state investment in the programs that the Initiative Foundations have been doing, which are working with providers to help them understand how to build more sustainable business models, how to access the training that they need to get higher reimbursement rates through the Parent Aware program. How do communities figure out what the solutions are for themselves for the crisis, and so on and so forth. The second thing is DEED has a grant program that they've run for providers, for communities and such that has been helpful. And so, we've seen things with the YMCA in Wilmer expanded their childcare capacity with a DEED grant. We've seen a similar thing up in up towards Duluth. I can't think of the community offhand, But these little, a $45,000, $50,000 grant goes a long way in building out capacity in some of these situations. So we want to see those things happen. And then the other thing that we had is in the bonding bill this year, we created these new capital programs for communities in greater Minnesota to build out their infrastructure needs. Because one of the things we know is that childcare businesses have a hard time accessing capital in the private sector because it's a really tricky business model. And so these programs would allow communities and providers access to capital that they may not be able to get in the private sector. Unfortunately, in the bonding bill, we created the programs, but we didn't fund the programs. And so our hope is that we can get the programs funded and move forward. But we know out of some of the work that both that you all did and then the Northland Foundation has done, we have a general sense as to what the capital need or capital cost is going to be to build out 40,000 childcare slots. Those don't just magically happen. They need investment to make it. And so hopefully this is a bucket that will help us move in that direction.
Wow, that's fantastic. And like you said, you know what needs to be done. It's doing it. And I also think of childcare providers. I know several childcare providers in greater Minnesota, and they're all so passionate about their work. But sometimes it's hard when it comes to that business aspect. They're kind of going under because you can't find that balance because people can't either afford to pay. There's just so many different circumstances. And so just helping them to have that access to capital, number one, but then also just, business savvy and knowing what they can do and can't do and helping them out that way.
Well, and part of our challenge too in the childcare sector is so often, especially in the family setting, it's not a lifelong childcare provider. It's a family who had a kid and have decided if I'm going to be home raising my kid, why don't I have some others in the house for the next 5 or 7 years until my kids are off to school, and then I'll shut this down and go back in the workforce. And so how do you support that provider in figuring out, how do you take an idea from the back of a napkin and turn it into a business in short order and make it work so you can get through those 5 or 7 years?
Yeah, just finding it to cash flow. And because, gosh, we need those people. We need those people. So I'm thinking as we wrap up here, it's January when we're recording this. Question, do you think we're going to get done on time in May? Crystal ball.
I hope so. I think
Me too.
I think we can do it. I think a lot of will depend on how that February forecast comes out. If we move from the $1.3 billion deficit into a $1 billion or $900 million, that's a pretty manageable deficit. I'm not one to promote, gaming the process. But one of the tools that we have used in the past on budget deficits is the K-12 shift, where you shift the spending from one biennium to the next biennium. In a normal situation, that's probably not a good tool to use. But everything we've seen from this recession is that it was truly driven by the pandemic and the need to shut the economy down. The economy was strong prior to, March 16th. The economy will be strong again once the vaccine takes hold and, everything is back up and our restaurants and our bars and our movie theaters are going again. And so, it may not be bad policy to think about how do you maintain the investments that we need and maybe use some bookkeeping to get past things. Just knowing that at some point the economy is going to be back to what it was and we move things forward. At the same time, a $900 million budget deficit from, spending reductions is easier to do than, $1.3 billion or so. So, February will be telling. I do think they'll get things done. I think there's a desire. I think the electorate has sent a strong message in recent years that they want government to work better. I think we've got leaders in the House and Senate and Governor Walz that want to work together and get things done. But if they don't, then they have until June 30th to finalize it and get their work done.
Well, we know all about that June 30th date, don't we? Gosh, over the last, I forget how many sessions, but yeah, gosh, I hope you're right, and I'm with you, and I'm optimistic. And, I know that Minnesota makes the news a lot for being the only divided legislature, and I'm quite proud of that. I think it's great. You're forcing people to work together, and it's the way it is. You got to balance the budget somehow. So,
yeah, although it'll be interesting to see how the working together happens when you're working together via Zoom call rather than sitting down in a room getting these things done. It's a whole different element that we're not quite sure about.
Yeah, there's something to be said about in-person contact. And yeah, boy, I don't know about you, but I get zoomed out, and I can't imagine those legislators. They're going to be doing 15-minute meetings back to back to back all the time. So that will be interesting. But I'm guessing technology is here to stay, and hopefully we can get to a hybrid model where we can see each other face to face again and use technology if we need to.
I hope so.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott. Great talking with you. And I hope that we can pop in maybe mid-session and get an update and see where we're at.
Absolutely. Would love to. And thank you for this opportunity, Julie.
You've been listening to the Center of Everywhere podcast, where we explore stories of rural Minnesotans who are making a difference in their communities. Rural isn't in the middle of nowhere. It is in the center of everywhere.